The rain had already soaked through her coat by the time she reached the third house. She knocked anyway. She didn't look like danger. She didn't sound desperate. But she was both. The kind of desperate that doesn't yell or scream, just keeps going. One knock at a time. Her daughter, Ava, was asleep on her shoulder, wrapped in a wet blanket. Her tiny face was red from the wind, her breath shallow from the cold. Lila pulled the blanket tighter around her, knocked again, and waited. Nothing. Door after door, block after block. Some opened and offered polite lies. "Sorry, we're just heading out." Some opened and stared like she was a question they didn't want to answer. And some didn't open at all. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking to stay the night. She just wanted to charge her phone, warm up for a moment, give her daughter a breath of safety. 17 doors, 17 rejections. By the time she reached the 18th house, she didn't even expect anyone to answer. She knocked once, then again. Nothing. But the porch light was on. The curtains shifted once. Still, the door stayed closed. So she sat down on the curb. She didn't cry. Not anymore. That part had passed somewhere around door number 9. She just held Ava tighter, whispered a bedtime story through chattering teeth, and let the rain fall. She didn't know it yet, but inside that house, behind that door, someone had been watching. And when it finally opened, everything changed. The storm had rolled in earlier than expected. By mid-afternoon, the sky had dropped low and heavy, turning the streets into rivers and the air into something colder than it should have been. Lila zipped up Ava's coat all the way to her chin and tucked the hood around her curls, whispering, "We're just going for a walk, baby. We'll be back soon." She didn't know if that was true. She said it anyway. The power had gone out 2 hours earlier in her apartment. Again. It wasn't the first time. The landlord said he'd fix the breaker box next week. But last week, it had been a broken lock. Before that, the heat. And now, with her phone battery nearly dead and no way to call for help, she had to make a choice. She wasn't scared of asking for help. She was scared of how people looked at you when you did. The first door was friendly enough. A man in a polo shirt opened, just wide enough to show the chain lock. She told him the truth. Not the whole sob story, just the part that mattered. "Hi, I'm sorry. I live around the corner. Our power's out, my daughter's cold, and I just need to charge my phone. Maybe a few minutes to warm up. That's all." He frowned, apologized, said something about not being comfortable these days, then gently closed the door. The second house didn't answer. The third told her the same thing. And the fourth? The woman behind the glass looked her dead in the eye and pulled the curtain closed, like she was closing a chapter. By the 7th house, Lila had stopped adjusting her tone. By the 10th, she stopped hoping, but she didn't stop knocking. Ava was light, but after 45 minutes of carrying her, the ache in Lila's arms began to crawl into her shoulders. She shifted her daughter's weight and pressed on, soaked through, breathing into the top of Ava's hood, just to give her some warmth. The houses all started to blur together. Neat porches, clean mailboxes, candles flickering in the windows. Warmth, just on the other side of a door she couldn't get through. At the 14th house, a man stepped out and actually let her speak. She told him the same story. He looked at Ava. He paused. For a second, she thought maybe, just maybe, he would nod, hold the door, let them in for 5 minutes. But he smiled stiffly and said, "You know, you really should try the shelter downtown. They're set up for this sort of thing." She didn't argue. She said thank you and left. What else was there to say? By the time she reached door 17, her legs felt numb and her fingertips burned from the cold. Her voice was hoarse. Ava had stopped asking where they were going. She'd stopped speaking entirely, curled up against her chest, head heavy with sleep. Lila stood in front of the next house and didn't knock right away. She stared at the brass numbers nailed into the wood. 1, 7. She looked at the door, at the window above it. She could see a flicker of movement inside. Someone watching. Another face behind a curtain. She knocked anyway. No answer. And then, finally, the last house. One more try. One more chance, even if she didn't believe in them anymore. Door 18. Warm light in the window. A small potted plant on the porch. A wind chime swaying in the breeze, clinking gently against the rain. She knocked. No sound inside. No footsteps. No flicker in the curtain. But the porch light stayed on. So Lila sat down on the step. Not to rest. She couldn't afford rest, but because she had nowhere else to go. No more houses on the block. No more battery. No more breath left for explaining herself. She pulled Ava tighter into her lap, curled her body around her, and hummed the lullaby her mother used to sing. A few lights flickered inside the house. She didn't notice. But someone inside was watching. Lila had no idea how long she'd been sitting there. Time stretches differently when you're cold, when you're tired, when you're holding a child who trusts you, even when the world doesn't. Ava stirred now and then in her arms, her fingers twitching beneath the blanket, her breath slow and shallow against Lila's neck, the kind of sleep that's not quite restful, just resigned. She thought for a brief moment about knocking again. One more try, one more fist on wood, but even that felt too heavy. So she just sat, eyes on the ground, trying not to think about what she'd do when Ava woke up. She had no answer for that. Then, the door creaked. Not all at once. Not loud, just a slow, deliberate turn of the knob, followed by the faintest sound of hinges giving in to something that had been waiting patiently. Lila turned her head, startled but too exhausted to react. The door opened halfway, and standing behind it was an older woman. Small, maybe in her late 70s, with silver hair pinned back, and a long cardigan wrapped tightly around her frame. She didn't say anything right away. She didn't smile. She just looked at the soaked blanket, at Lila's face, at Ava, curled like a comma in her mother's arms. Then, softly, she spoke. "You've been out here a while." Her voice was soft, not delicate, but measured, like she didn't waste words on things she didn't mean. Lila tried to speak, but only a thin, cracked sound came out. "I didn't mean to bother anyone." The woman nodded gently, like she understood that this wasn't just about tonight. "You didn't. I was watching." That caught Lila off guard. She blinked, unsure what she meant. The woman stepped forward, just enough to see them fully in the porch light. "I saw you at the third house, then the sixth. I watched you try every single one. I wanted to know if you were real or just passing through." Lila didn't know what to say. She didn't even know what that meant, but the woman opened the door wider. "Come in, let's get her warm." Lila hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because part of her didn't trust it, this sudden kindness after so many cold shoulders. The woman must have seen that. "It's okay. I don't open my door for everyone, but I open it for people who don't give up." And just like that, Lila stepped inside. Not into a mansion, not into some hidden oasis of wealth and warmth, just a clean, quiet home. The kind where the heat is always working and the air smells like tea and old books. Ava stirred as the warmth hit her cheeks, her eyes fluttering open. And Lila? For the first time in days, she let herself breathe. The warmth inside the house wasn't just physical. It was the kind that seeps into your chest and makes you realize just how cold you've been. Lila stepped through the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. Her shoes left soft, wet marks on the hardwood floor, but the woman didn't flinch. She just guided her gently toward the couch, then disappeared for a moment, without a word. Ava stirred again, blinking slowly, her voice small. "Where are we, Mommy?" Lila kissed her forehead and whispered, "Somewhere safe." The woman returned with a stack of towels, 2 soft blankets, and a ceramic mug that she set beside Lila on the coffee table. Steam rose from it, chamomile, and something faintly floral. "I'm Mrs. Ellison," she said simply, kneeling beside them. "This tea's for you. There's cocoa warming on the stove for her." She didn't ask questions right away. She didn't dig into details. She just moved through the space, like someone who knew how to handle people on the edge, with calmness, not curiosity. A few minutes later, Ava sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a warm mug, her face flushed from heat, eyes brighter already. Lila stayed quiet, wrapped in the blanket, watching her daughter settle like a leaf in still water. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You saw me knocking. Why didn't you come sooner?" Mrs. Ellison sat across from her, stirring her own tea slowly. Her hands were thin, knuckles a little swollen, the hands of someone who'd once done hard work and still carried the memory in her joints. "Because I don't answer every knock. I've lived on this street a long time, and not all doors should open fast. People have taken advantage before, pretended to need help, and left with more than they came for." She looked up, her voice softer now. "But you weren't performing. You weren't yelling. You weren't even angry. You just kept knocking. And when the last door didn't open, you stayed anyway. That told me who you are." Lila swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She didn't want to cry, but the kindness was too much, too simple, too rare. In the days that followed, Mrs. Ellison didn't just offer warmth. She offered connection. She called her church and asked about emergency housing. She reached out to her nephew, who ran a local garage, and had him come by to look at Lila's broken car, free of charge. She helped Ava register at the nearest preschool and introduced Lila to a woman down the street who had a part-time job opening at her cafe. There was no big speech. No, "Let me save you." Just quiet action. And it worked. One evening, as they shared dinner at Mrs. Ellison's small round table, Lila looked at her and asked the question that had been sitting on her chest since the first night. "Why did you help me?" Mrs. Ellison didn't pause. "Because I know what it's like to be on the other side of the door. And I remember how it felt when someone finally opened one for me." That was all she said. And it was everything. 3 months later, Lila stood in the kitchen of her new apartment. Nothing fancy, but it had warm light, working heat, and locks that made her feel safe. Ava was asleep in the next room, the stuffed bunny Mrs. Ellison had given her tucked under one arm. The part-time job had turned into something steadier. The car was running again. Her phone stayed charged now. There were groceries in the fridge, and every week, without fail, she went back to that little house at the end of the block. Not because she had to, but because you don't forget the hand that reached for you when the world turned its back. Mrs. Ellison never made a show of it. She didn't treat Lila like a project or a charity case. When they talked, it was about flowers, about books, about Ava's newest drawing. And when Lila tried to thank her, really thank her, she always waved it off. It was just one door, she'd say. You did the hard part. You kept knocking. But Lila knew better. It wasn't just a door. It was the door. The one that stayed closed just long enough to see if you were real, and opened wide enough to remind you that you mattered. One afternoon, Lila brought a potted lily to the house. She placed it gently on the porch, next to the wind chime that had swayed above her head that first night. There was a small tag tied to the stem. In her own handwriting it said, "For door 18, the one that watched, the one that waited, the one that believed." Years later, Ava, now tall, strong, and always asking questions, came home from school with an essay titled, "The Kindest Thing Anyone Ever Did." She handed it to her mom, proud but shy. The story was simple. A rainy night, a mother with nowhere left to go, and an old woman who opened a door that changed everything. At the bottom, the last line read, "I live in a warm home because of one open door, one soft voice, one person who believed we were worth saving. In a world full of doors that close too quickly, one stayed shut just long enough to know who was knocking, and when it finally opened, it opened forever."